Now, I will say, if I'm being honest with you, and this is maybe a moment of unexpected bipartisanship, but I feel pretty bad for my Democratic colleague, Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota. I do. No, he hasn't been a very good governor, and that's definitely true. But Tim Walz has got the toughest job in American politics. Think about this. He's got to go around and try to convince the American people that Kamala Harris can be the president of the United States. That's pretty tough work. Now, by contrast, what I've got to get out there and do is I've got to go and talk about how Donald J. Trump was the best president of my lifetime, and he's going to do it again if we give him more time. I get to talk about how Donald Trump had inflation at 1.5%. I get to talk about the fact that Donald Trump, when he was president, take-home pay was rising faster than it had in 40 years. I get to talk about the fact that the Mexican drug cartels were on the run and the border was closed when Donald J. Trump was president. And I get to talk about the fact that it's going to be even better and even bigger, and we are going to rebuild a golden age of American prosperity during the second term of President Donald J. Trump. That's pretty easy. That's pretty easy work, but now Tim Walz, of course, he's got to talk about Kamala Harris. Well, what's the record? Well, record number one is grocery prices have risen faster in Pennsylvania than almost any state in the union. And I didn't realize that actually until a few weeks ago. The record of Kamala Harris is that the border is wide open. We've got fentanyl flooding Pennsylvania communities. We've got a record number of overdose deaths. We've got people who can't even afford to buy a home in the community they were raised in because Kamala Harris has got mortgage interest rates through the roof. And let's be honest, she's letting illegal aliens get into homes that ought by right go to American citizens. She is. So Tim Walz, I think they've come up with a different strategy. Their strategy is, I think, to pretend that Kamala Harris has never even met Joe Biden. You notice they never appear in the same place together. You would think that, she's wearing garlic and he's a vampire. They never are in the same place together, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. She doesn't talk at all unless she makes a mistake in an interview. She talks about all these things she's going to do. It's actually kind of shameless. It's kind of shameless to say, as the sitting vice president on day one, we're going to lower the price of groceries. She's the sitting vice president. She says on day one, we are going to close down that southern border. And I think all of us with an ounce of common sense are saying day one was 1,400 days ago. What the hell have you been doing, Kamala Harris? Go do your job. Stop talking about you're going to do your job. So as much as she pretends, Kamala Harris is not the candidate of change. Kamala Harris is the candidate of more of the same. She's the candidate of higher grocery prices because she already did it. She's the candidate of higher housing prices because she already did it. She's the candidate of open borders because not only did she brag about wanting to open the border, she actually opened the border when she got into office. And of course, as we're learning with this terrible conflict in the Middle East, Kamala Harris is the candidate of chaos and war all over the world. So I will say, the thing that is sometimes Kamala Harris, when she gets a tough interview or even a softball interview, because Kamala, she doesn't really do tough interviews. You ever notice that? I'll get more tough questions from the reporters standing back there than Kamala Harris has done the entire campaign. In fact, my wife joked with me a few weeks ago because she had taken a few questions from reporters. She looked at me and said, well, now I've taken more questions than the Vice President of the United States. And that was true. But, the thing about Kamala Harris's strategy of only doing softball interviews, I know we've got some baseball fans in the room, is if you're going to do a softball interview, you've got to be able to actually hit a softball. And it turns out that every time somebody interviews Kamala Harris, she reveals that whatever she may claim, she is the candidate of more of the same. And I don't know if you saw this interview. She did it a couple of weeks ago with The View. And, you'll never hear me complain about running for vice president except this one time I watched Kamala Harris on The View so that you didn't have to. And I'm telling you, I'm about 20 IQ points dumber for having done it, but these are the sacrifices I'm willing to make for the people of Pennsylvania. But here, But here is what she said. Think about it. The theme of her whole campaign is that she wouldn't do what Joe Biden would do. She'd be somehow different, even though she's the sitting vice president. So they asked her, name one thing that you would have done differently from Joe Biden over the last 4 years. And she said, first of all, she gets kind of a blank look, and then she says, well, nothing comes to mind. Now, in Kamala Harris's defense, I do think that could be the slogan of the Harris-Walz campaign, is nothing comes to mind. Because think about it, what is Kamala Harris actually going to do to lower the price of groceries? Nothing comes to mind. What are you going to do to close down that southern border? Nothing comes to mind. Right? So this is the slogan of the Kamala Harris campaign, but it blew up the entire idea that she somehow is going to be different. If you're voting for Kamala Harris, you're voting for more of the same. You're voting for wide open borders. You're voting for higher grocery prices. You're voting for America to be disrespected all over the world. And if you're voting for Donald Trump, you're voting for peace and prosperity and the American dream. And that's what all of us are voting for. So let's talk a little bit about Kamala Harris's economic policies, such as they are, because I think it's sometimes useful. People care about the details. I think the American media and certainly some of our political candidates assume that the American people don't care about the details at all. I think that's why whenever they ask Kamala Harris, well, what is your specific plan to lower the cost of food? She'll say, well, I grew up in a middle-class family. Or when they ask her, how are you going to actually bring peace and stability to the world stage? She'll say, I used to work at McDonald's and I made the hash browns and I was very good at it. And, I don't even know if I believe that, by the way. I think that maybe Donald J. Trump has worked at McDonald's for longer than Kamala Harris has. I don't know if you saw that. And to the media, that's just one man's opinion. I'm not certain, of course, but it's interesting that Kamala Harris can't answer any details about what she wants to do for the American people. So let's just compare and contrast. If you go on her website and look at her plans, you're going to get one of two things. The first thing you might get is an idea that Donald Trump came up with a week earlier. Because if you notice, she copies a lot from Donald J. Trump. It is plagiarism. Oh, that's a good point, sir. I forgot about that. One thing I bring to the table, my friends, is that unlike Kamala Harris, I actually wrote my own book, whereas Kamala Harris plagiarized hers. That's a difference. But we also, on the Trump campaign, we actually wrote our own policy proposals, whereas Kamala Harris just steals them from President Donald J. Trump. Now, a few examples of this. Donald Trump was actually talking to some waitresses in Nevada, and he was talking about how the IRS goes after people who are, some of them are barely making it. Some of them are doing okay, but not great. But he said, why is the IRS harassing you for your tips wages? We'd probably save more money and give you a pay increase if we just said no tax on tips. And so Donald Trump came out with that policy, no tax on tips, and we're going to fight to make that happen. We're going to fight to eliminate taxes on overtime, because that's another important thing. If you're working hard or you're working extra, you ought to be able to benefit from it. And another thing that we are going to do, of course, is that we're going to close the border. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Kamala Harris has copied all three of those proposals, though maybe she's only copied two of the three. But I was talking to the president a few weeks ago. I said, sir, I figured out what's going on. She thinks that you're going to get elected the next president, and she's auditioning for my job. That's why she keeps on copying you. And I think that tomorrow, actually, at her rally, she's going to come out in a Navy suit and a red MAGA hat and try to just confuse the people to vote for her because clearly she doesn't have any ideas of her own. So that's one category of Kamala Harris ideas, the one that she steals from Donald J. Trump. Here's a second category of Kamala Harris ideas, the ones that just don't make any sense, okay? Because think about this. If you want to create broad-based prosperity, not just for the workers in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but if you want to lower energy costs for every American consumer, what you ought to be doing is opening up American energy, drill, baby, drill. And that's the most important proposal. I think that's the most important proposal to lower the cost of inflation, because think about this. If you're making the truck drivers pay 45% more for diesel, they're the ones who are delivering the groceries to the grocery store, so now all of our groceries are going up. Or if you take a guy who's delivering lumber to a construction site, make him pay 40% more for gasoline, and all of us are going to pay higher housing costs because those are the people building the houses. That's why Kamala Harris's policies are so broken. She's raising the cost of energy, which means she's raising the cost of everything else. Now, we got plenty of energy, especially right here in Pennsylvania. We're sitting on the Saudi Arabia of natural gas in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So if you compare what Kamala Harris wants to do with what Donald Trump wants to do, Kamala Harris wants us to buy oil and gas from tin-pot dictators all over the world. Donald Trump wants us to buy oil and gas from Pennsylvania workers and from our own territory. We got plenty of it right here. Let's get it out of the ground. Now, Pennsylvania, and I, of course, represent the great state of Ohio. Pennsylvania has suffered. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and a couple of other states have suffered because a generation of American leaders shipped all of our good manufacturing jobs off to places like Mexico and to China. Now, I believe that the only way to rebuild the great American industrial base is to do two things: give tax cuts to hardworking Americans and to people who are creating jobs in the United States of America, and penalize corporations that are shipping jobs overseas. That's how you rebuild Pennsylvania's manufacturing economy. And of course, Kamala Harris wants to do exactly the opposite. She wants to raise your taxes, and then she wants to reward foreign corporations for shipping American jobs overseas. Now, I've never, my friends, seen anything like it. Even the politicians who want to raise your taxes, they'll go around and say they want to cut taxes. But Kamala Harris is the first politician I've ever seen who is going around promising to raise taxes to the tune of about $2,500 per family just in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense. It almost makes me think that Kamala Harris knows that Donald Trump would be a better president, so she's just going to tank her whole campaign by saying she's going to raise everybody's taxes. But the only way for us to get reasonable tax policy, reasonable regulatory policy, the only way for us to drill, baby, drill is to make Donald Trump the next president of the United States, and that's what we've got to do. Now, let's talk about the other big crisis that Kamala Harris has unleashed on this country. And by the way, we could talk about any number of policy issues. We could talk about, why don't we have schools that educate our kids instead of indoctrinate our kids with Kamala Harris's values? I'd take that. Why don't we have a president who fights for the rights of Christians and other people of faith to practice their faith rather than attacks religious believers with the power of the federal government? That's common sense. So we could talk a lot about Kamala Harris's lack of common sense, but there's nowhere where it's had a more destructive effect on the United States of America than that wide open southern border. And let's, of course, talk about all the ways. Now, normally what the media focuses on is the fact that the Mexican drug cartels are bringing fentanyl across the southern border. And that is a big problem, and it's going to stop when Donald J. Trump is president. But there's other problems that come along with that wide open border. Just think about this. We've got thousands of children in Pennsylvania schools who don't even speak English, which of course means that a lot of Pennsylvania children are not getting the education that they need. Now, I don't begrudge any child or any family for wanting a better life in the United States of America, but number one, you've got to come through the legal way. You got to come through the proper channels. And number two, how disgraceful is it to have a vice president of the United States that is making it hard for American children to get the education that they deserve? You hear Kamala Harris talk a lot about compassion. Compassion for illegal aliens, compassion for people who don't have the right to be in the United States of America. Let's try a little compassion for American children who deserve to get a good education. Let's try a little compassion for American parents and American grandparents who have seen hospital wait times shoot through the roof. And there are a lot of reasons for it, but one of the reasons is that when you let in 25 million people into your country who don't have the right to be here, then that means a lot of the important social services like healthcare do not exist for the Americans who need it. The other thing that comes when you have a lot of illegal immigration is, think about this. When you've got 25 million people who shouldn't be here, you got to put them somewhere. And by the way, some of them are being put up in five-star hotel rooms at your expense. But you got to put them somewhere. And what does that mean? That means that there are American homes that are going not to American citizens, but to people that Kamala Harris has let stream across that southern border. Donald Trump, and I promise you that when he's back in the White House, we're going to follow a very simple principle to make the American dream of homeownership affordable again. American homes go to American people, not to people who don't deserve to be in this country. So I want to leave you with one final thought here, and then I'll take some questions from the reporters, because, you know, the thing that bothers me the most about Kamala Harris's campaign, about Kamala Harris's leadership, it's not just that I disagree with her on all these policy issues. The thing that bothers me the most is that Kamala Harris doesn't want to persuade her fellow citizens. She wants to censor them. We have never seen in the history of this country a major political candidate endorse the idea of silencing people. And she proposes to do it through social media censorship. She proposes to do it by having bureaucrats lie about their fellow citizens. She proposes to do it, and we've seen it done by sending actual federal law enforcement to harass parents who are peacefully protesting at their children's school board meeting. The biggest threat to America, it's not any foreign competitor. It's the idea coming from American leaders that we should censor our fellow citizens instead of persuade and talk to one another, and that's coming from Kamala Harris. So here's what I promise you. When Donald J. Trump is president, we may agree on a lot of issues. We may disagree from time to time, but I will fight for your right to speak your mind. We will never try to silence you. We will try to persuade you and actually talk to our fellow citizens. And there is, of course, no greater censorship than when Kamala Harris says that those of us who want a secure and strong southern border are racists, are bad people for daring to want to protect our countries and have safe communities. That is a terrible, terrible disgrace. I've never in my life seen an American leader attacking the citizens of her own country for daring to voice an opinion about Kamala Harris's failures. And that's exactly what she does. So my message to Kamala Harris is there is nothing compassionate about letting the Mexican drug cartels ransack our country. There is nothing compassionate about flooding Pennsylvania communities with fentanyl. There is nothing compassionate about letting the American southern border be open. We are not bad people for wanting to secure that border. You're a bad person for opening that border in the first place.